Okay, welcome people of the future, because we are in the past. Because again, this is a pre-record. It is a fine Saturday afternoon here in
Hmm.
these great old United States, and today we're going to be talking about a subject that is special for the both of us because we're both lifelong comic book fans. Um, well, I mean, I've always been into like Marvel, DC stuff. I
Right.
was heavy into comics, I guess, and mostly in elementary school, early middle school. For much of elementary school, I was a subscriber to Marvel Comics, a few of their stuff,
Mhm.
like a few of their titles. I remember I had a regular subscription to Hulk and What If,
Oh yeah.
and for a while X Men, and yeah. So after even after I got a little older and I stopped subscribing to comic books, I've always been to characters, because of the movies and the video games.
Yeah.
And when I was in college, I had like a lot of free time, like on the weekends, like during the afternoons. So like on a Saturday afternoon, I would just go over to Barnes and Noble, and I would just get like a huge ass cup of like, a huge ass latte or whatever, and I would just spend the day like at Barnes and Noble just reading an entire graphic novel cover to cover, not
Yep.
even buying it, right? Just going to the graphic novels
You're one of
section,
those.
just sitting down and just reading it through and then putting it back,
Hmm.
right? Yeah, it's kind of a dick move. But that's how I kept up with comics, other than the TV shows and the movies. And
Yeah.
I was also into drawing as a kid as well. And yeah, just been a lifelong Marvel and DC nerd, uh, as you are as well, Jason.
Oh yeah.
So that's been my, I guess, before we start my relationship with Marvel DC. Jason, tell us your relationship with Marvel DC.
So I learned to read because of comics. My father was also into comics. Like he had all of the original
Hmm.
Fantastic Fours and Avengers and Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy, all of it, right? And of course, he goes off to Nam, and basically they all get sold at a garage sale, except for one, which I have. I think I showed you that one. I have it hanging on my wall. Actually, two. There's two.
Okay.
I have them hanging. So of course my dad was always supportive of it. But yeah, I learned how to read because of comics. My first comic was actually Transformers issue 42.
Oh, you
Uh,
remember?
oh yeah. Oh no, I've still got it. And I learned to read. The neighborhood kids, we were all into comics, and that's how I learned how to read. And of course, you know, artists, so that didn't help. Give me a lot of fun things to draw and think about. And like anyone else, you get into comics, but there's a lot of different levels to being a comic fan, right? There's
Hmm.
like it's like anything else, right? There's the
Yeah,
people
I
who just
consider
enjoy
myself a more
reading.
of a casual fan.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
fine. It's not a big, like I don't look down on anyone. It's like I hate these people who are like, well, you're not a real fan. Just stop, right? It, like what you like, right? I
Yeah.
don't like
You
that
like
stuff.
what you like.
But it's like, there's certain levels, and really, and my dad took me to my first comic book shop. It was in Duncanville, and it was run by, I think I've talked about this before. I love that place. It was in it's still around, but the guy who started it worked for Frito Lay, but he was uh, I'm sorry, no, so he did a job when he was younger at Frito Lay, but he was actually an engineer, and he worked for Boeing at the time before he retired, but to start the comic book shop, and he was a POW from Krakow. He had been,
Hmm.
yeah, he was Polish, and they had him tattooed the whole 9 yards, right? Place smelled like it was a used bookstore. Remember those things were all over the place.
Hmm.
Used bookstore and comic shop. There was actually another used bookstore and comic shop just a few, like 2-3 miles down the road, that I went to from time to time also. Um Place smelled like newsprint and cigarettes. I loved it. It's my favorite smell in the world.
You find some real gems in those
Oh yeah.
dusty old used bookstores, don't you?
Yep.
Find some real gems.
And I just couldn't go back, right? I mean, I couldn't turn away from this. Once my dad had shown I could go, we'd go, I'd get new issues, back issues. I remember discovering old Mirage, because this is like the early 90s at this point. But I found the old Mirage black and white Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the where they
The
started.
original ones, yeah.
Oh yeah, dude. It was it was eye-opening to see all these different types. So yeah, I like everyone else. I start off with, Marvel. Transformers was owned by Marvel at the time. GI Joe, same thing. They were all published by Marvel at the time. I was definitely a Marvel kid versus DC. Like
Hmm.
Marvel was always hipper, it was faster, it was better paced. I love the art better.
I
Um,
thought so too.
yeah,
I
it
thought so
was.
too.
It's and Spider-Man was my guy. Like Spider, still my guy, right? But then you find like the indie comics. You find, and of course I'm coming, I'm a teenager during the 90s, so it's like I'm finding all the 90s stuff, your Jim Lees, then you get Spawn and McFarlane and all that. But finding these indie comics, finding Mirage, and then you get into the history comics, right? And you get a little bit older and you find out about Will Eisner and the
Hmm.
spirit and a contract with God, and then of course Frank Miller comes out with Sin City. I remember the first issue I bought of Sin City. It was in A Dame to Kill For. It was like the last issue of A Dame to Kill For. The art just blew me away. I bought it because of the cover. And of course, you get into things. You find the European stuff, and you're like, "What's heavy metal? What is this magazine about?" Right? You
Well,
find
I
your,
remember that. Yeah.
you get into Judge Dredd, and so you start taking these deep dives into things. You find out who like. There's a lot of stuff that's sort of more common knowledge now, but in late '90s, early 2000s, you find out about Bill Finger and all of that, and you start really to I loved Kirby as a kid. I was one of
Hmm.
the
Jack Kirby. Yeah.
like I was one of those people. This is not a, but everyone starts off. They look at you do one or two things with Kirby starting off when you're younger. You either absolutely love what he was doing, or you don't like it and you don't get it at all.
Hmm.
Kirby is an artist's artist, right? There's um, a lot of people talk about how Norm Macdonald was a comedian's comedian, right? Where his artwork is like, I mean, kids like there was a reason why he was the king, right? The man was the king. Everyone loved him, but some people looked at his artwork like, I don't get it. But when you get older, particularly when you get into the 70s, I think this is something we tend to miss. Like in the 70s, you finally start getting inkers who would ink him more faithfully. We can talk about the
Ah,
how the artwork is made here in a little bit,
yeah. I
but
was about to bring that up for, you might have to explain to people
yeah,
at
let me
home,
explain
like,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. Just real quick, particularly for these mass produced comics like the Avengers and all that, what you have is it has to be broken out because particularly in this, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and 70s and 80s, these people aren't making a lot of money. And even the really all the money is coming from ad revenue.
Hmm.
So you got to turn out these pages real fast, right? Well, again, because of the technology of the day, a pencil isn't really, your pencil work isn't going to hold up for reprint. So you have a penciler that's your main artist, like a Jack Kirby, and then you have, or your Bishimas, and then you have an inker come along and they ink that pencil work and gives it something more definite so that they can photograph it, and then they have this other process to um where that black
Hmm.
ink can be reproduced on plate, right?
Let me ask you this question only for the people, for the sake of
Right.
people
Yeah.
listening at home, because they're probably going to have this question.
Mhm.
Why do you need to have a separate inker and a separate penciler? Why can't the artist do both?
That's for time, because essentially, if you've got a Jack Kirby, and he's doing like 3 books of, he's telling like 3 different stories a month, right? He's got
Hmm.
to be able to get that out quick. And then your inkers, you can give it to different inkers, and they'll go and they'll complete a bunch of pages,
Hmm.
and that way you're like, okay, now it's something that can be printed, right? And because you got to make that date, right? You got to make those numbers. Instead of having one guy do all of the artwork, you break it up. So while he's penciling, you got another guy inking. Then once those inked pages are done, somebody comes along and letters the comic, right? So
So it's
you
more
so
of
you
like a streamlining of the process, really.
well, it's less streamlining, it's more time efficiency, right?
Mm.
I mean, and that's how most major comics were produced. Even comic strips were produced when comic strips were a bigger business, particularly the action comics. You'd have a lot of these guys doing comic books and comic strips in like an office, and they
Mm.
would knock this stuff out. So you'd have like Jack Kirby doing this, and you'd have Vince Coletta over here doing this, right? And it was or Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, they both created Captain America together. They had a little comic house for a while, and they were in Kirby was not really the businessman. Simon was. So Simon was really the one running the shop. But they would knock out a bunch of different They would do like cartoons for advertisements. They would do comic strips for not like cartoons, but like cartoon characters and cartoon advertising. And then they would do comic strips that get published in newspapers, because that was a big thing. But you have to remember, back in the day, none of this was big money. It was just none of this is the big money that it is today. And in fact, really, we don't start seeing that big money until the 2000s. They made money, yeah, and we can talk about the, in the history of things, like, well, what about your Todd McFarlane's and what was going on with Image in the 90s? That's a whole thing. But for the longest time, comics were a disposable medium. That was the whole point, right? You chucked them out, and then you got a new one the next month. It was disposable. That was sort of the beauty behind them in a way. You weren't supposed to be saving them. It was something a kid read, and maybe they had them in the back, but whatever. But they
until
kind of
people
got thrown away.
started saving them, and because
Yeah, and
everyone was all obsessed with them being worth something in the future, right?
Yeah, that's the 90s speculation. We
Yeah.
can come back to that. But yeah, so essentially you have these artists, right? And you have the inkers, and you start finding out who's the penciler, who's the inker, and you start seeing and developing, well, this guy looks like, you can start telling like one artist, but you have different inkers, you can get very different looks, right? Again, like Jack Kirby, like before the 70s, most everyone put their own, like you can really see some of these pencils, because what they would do is you'd have the penciler, and then they would be reproduced in non-photo blue, right? And then the inker would come and ink that. Because again, non-photo blue it doesn't show up on camera, so the ink shows up better. You can see how drastically some of these inkers were changing some of the artwork. So, when you see what Kirby was doing, his actual pencils and a lot of this artwork, you realize he was almost abstracting the figure in ways. And it was really, really interesting. But you get into that, right? I was one of those people who loved what Kirby was doing. You could see it, but people tend to forget. Yes, the idea of telling stories through images is a very old idea. It goes all the way back to the caves, right? That's essentially the thing. But comic books as a medium, they've really only existed for about 100 years. The earliest comic books weren't published until the 1920s. You could argue that pulp stuff was sort of like the earliest comic books, and that's true, but not true in the same time, right? A comic book is a very specific medium, and they start off as reproductions of newspaper comic strips in the 20s. So really, like I said, we're only about 100 years into this whole comic book thing, because this is sort of the first time in human history where the idea of being able to produce printed material on paper and mass distribute it quickly. This is the first time this has ever been done in human history, right?
Yeah.
So we're do they evolve out of the old dime store novels and pulps? Absolutely. But it's a new phenomenon. Superman isn't created until the 30s.
Yeah.
Right? He's the first superhero. And throughout that period, and since then, it's basically been, in fact, I think we just celebrated his 75th birthday it's been like 5 years or so. So, I mean, this is a new medium, and people tend to forget that while it's new in a broader perspective, it also has a long and storied history. Like, there were companies that existed for 30 or 40 years that don't exist anymore and were gone by the time the 80s showed up. So when most people look at them, they're like, yeah, well, I've never heard of that company, or that they probably didn't do anything. And you're like, this thing was a huge thing for 30 or 40 years.
Wasn't Captain Marvel an example of that, where he was actually with a different company and then he got bought out by DC after that company went under?
Okay. Oversimplification, but you're not wrong. Fawcett Comics was it Charlton or Fawcett? No, it was Fawcett City is the city he's at. I think it was Fawcett. Okay, I think it's I believe it was Fawcett Comics. So Superman comes out, and then Captain Marvel comes out.
Oh, I thought Captain Marvel was first for some reason.
No. Superman is the first comic book superhero. Period of story. He comes out, and there's a lot of litigation between them and Fawcett Comics for a long time. Charlton's a whole other story. But like they go back and forth because DC essentially at the time said, "Hey, you're copying Superman. This is a trademark infringement, right, on our character." Even though they are substantially different, but eventually, and here's the thing: people forget how popular he was at the beginning. Like he was as big as Superman, if not bigger in a lot of ways. If you saw the recent Elvis biopic, you get to see how influential Captain Marvel. It occurs to me, most people, if you're not into comics, you know him as Shazam.
Shazam, yeah.
Yeah, that's for the and so we'll talk about
We're
that
not
here in a
talking about the
second.
Brie Larson Captain Marvel. No,
No,
no.
that's a whole
That's a whole
conversation
other
we don't
thing.
necessarily
Yeah,
need to have.
yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking about Shazam.
Yeah, so yeah, Captain Marvel is his actual proper name. They renamed him because they got tired of fighting with Marvel about it. But before all that, you had Fawcett Comics, and it was huge. Again, Captain Marvel and the Shazam comics were as big as Superman for the longest period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to see why. It's, you're a kid, particularly, during the Depression, post-Depression, World War II. It's about a kid who could turn into the superhero. So it's easy to see why if you're 7, 8 years old, maybe even a little bit older, you're going to eat that up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually, DC kind of wins the lawsuit, and they buy the character. Now, this is where Marvel creates the Captain Marvel because they realized because DC bought the character and didn't do anything with it for some reason. They didn't renew certain licenses. So Marvel Comics was like, wait, you're telling me that the name Captain Marvel is available? So they go and they create Captain Marvel to have the name. And there was a lawsuit, and basically the courts came back and said, yeah, DC, you didn't renew this. You didn't get your paperwork done, so they can use Captain Marvel on the cover. That's why when DC brought him back, it was like the comic was called The Power of Shazam.
Yeah.
And he kept the name Captain Marvel, but The Power of Shazam. And eventually, people just kind of, even comic book people would still call him Shazam because that's what he would yell out to get
I
his
still call him
powers.
Captain Marvel.
What?
I still call him Captain Marvel.
Well, no, and you should. I
Yeah.
still do. But yeah, but that's an age thing. But
Do you
there were a lot
remember
of people who just called him Shazam.
Do you remember the old school Superman arcade game
Mhm.
back in the 80s where it was like a side scrolling where you're Superman, but then
Yep.
if you join in as player 2, you actually play as Shazam? I thought that
Well,
was
so here's the thing. It's actually you're still playing as Superman, but they use Captain Marvel's colors.
Yeah,
Which
it's a
is the
palette swap.
dumbest.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just a palette swap. That's all it was. And you're like, really? This is how you're going to play it? But whatever. Anyway, so the broader point is I got in learning to read as an artist. You get into it and you start finding out how interesting the business side of it is and the history of this medium and the people who influence it and push it forward. Your Will Eisner's who tells you who develops the idea of how to tell stories at different rates and different speeds. For people who are unfamiliar, like used to be every comic had 6 or 9 panels on it. Like that was it. You had 6 or 9 panels and word balloons were put in there and that was it. Like that was how you told your story. Will Eisner said, I can make pictures of different sizes or panels of different sizes and control how the person reads
Yeah.
the story. He figured that out. I mean, literally, he created sequential. He didn't create sequential comics, but he rewrote the language of how to do sequential comics. Then Jack Kirby comes along and says,
And for those of you who are listening who don't know, Jack Kirby is most famously credited for creating who?
so him and Stan Lee, and that's a whole other conversation. There'll be some people like, no, it was all Kirby. No, just stop with that argument. It was so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby create together the Hulk, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, the X-Men,
Thor.
Thor. Again, Kirby creates Captain America with Simon. We got Thor, we got Ant-Man, and which becomes Giant Man, of course, the Wasp at the same time. Again, all the
Silver
things.
Surfer?
Yeah, he creates the Silver Surfer with the Fantastic Four. I was kind of going in the line. Daredevil as well. Namor. No, he doesn't create Namor. Namor's created earlier by Everett. That happened before World War II, but he brings Namor back in the Fantastic Four. He creates he and Lee create um Galactus as well. Again, Doctor Doom. I think I mentioned Daredevil, the X-Men, Generation 1 X-Men.
What about Spider-Man?
No, that's Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Ditko creates Spider-Man and Doctor Strange
Yeah.
and Squirrel Girl.
So Jack
He
Kirby is a legend. He created a lot of these characters that we're
Yeah.
seeing today
Well,
everywhere now.
he created the Eternals. He created which the movie sucked, but that's a whole different thing. He created the Eternals, which also means the Celestials.
Hmm.
All of that. DC with Darkseid and the New Gods, Apocalypse, all of that. He created that. He very much played with ancient astronaut theory way back in the day. Like he was right there. There's a lot of themes that people point to for like, oh, this is ancient astronaut theory. I'm like, Kirby was doing that in the 60s. Calm yourself, right? His artwork on God is actually really interesting. Because he was Jewish, like all the early guys were, right?
Yeah.
Because they were all coming out of New York. They were just trying to find a way to make money. And again, his artwork's amazing. But so yeah, Jack Kirby basically created all that, but he also creates this language of how to tell, where Will Eisner tells you how to tell the story.
Oh, for people listening at home, who's Will Eisner? Like, what is he credited for?
Again, he's really interesting. He was a cartoonist. He's known for creating The Spirit, which got a movie. Actually, it's had a couple of movies. When it was
Alec Baldwin, right?
No, that was The Shadow.
Okay.
Yeah, the Spirit was that black and white thing that Rodriguez did with so Rodriguez and Miller did Sin City, then they go and they do the follow up with The Spirit, and it was not good. It was not good. Anyway, which was a shame because you had it had a great score. Anyway, that's a whole.
Wasn't that the one with Billy Zane in it?
No, that's the Phantom. That was the Phantom. That's Lee Falk. Lee Falk created the Phantom.
Okay.
But so long story short, Will Eisner, he really, his biggest impact isn't necessarily creating the Spirit, right? Which was a huge character, published all over the place in like 10, 15 different languages. The thing about Will Eisner is that he develops the idea of the graphic novel in the 70s. He's the first one to do it, and he stays his entire career. So there's this big conversation. This is, and again, ultimately will lead to this point, that you have your big publishing companies like Marvel and DC, right? And of course, you know, your Fawcett Comics and EC Comics and all that. But these publishing houses own the characters, right? All the work that, in fact, that's what a lot of these lawsuits have been about, is everyone's saying, hey, these artists and writers created these characters and they're getting no money. Their estates are getting no money for the billions of dollars they're bringing in. That's what a lot of this lawsuit's about. Well, that's never been a problem for Will Eisner because he never worked in those systems. He owned everything. He stayed independent the entire time. So he's out there publishing stuff with the Spirit all the time. And he did see comics as an art form, as Jack Kirby did. And so Will Eisner, he saw, I mean, you can go back and read a lot of his articles and interviews. The man saw the future of how comics would eventually develop. But he was always about owning his own work. He was about his business. And so he was always the one pioneering the art in a way. Jack Kirby wanted to draw, right? He was an artist. He didn't have the business side of it. What Jack Kirby innovated was, so where Will Eisner taught you how to tell the story, Jack Kirby showed you how to break those rules. Still using very much what Will Eisner did, but like he'd have characters leave a panel, right? Like you'd have, you know, the Hulk punching or the Thing punching somebody, and like his hand would go outside of that box, and he'd have characters standing and they'd overlap other boxes, right? He broke those rules, and he really created a level of dynamism that wasn't seen in comics before that. So those two, that's why he's the king, right? The man was the king. He created all these ideas and all this visual language. But he worked within the system, which is why he was very bitter about a lot of things, and he should have been, right? He got screwed. All of those old artists and writers got screwed. About the only one who didn't really get screwed was Stan Lee.
Oh,
That's
I
because
think
he
this
was
would be a
about
good
his
time.
business.
This will be a good time, I guess, Jason, to tell the audience at home how Marvel and DC they do their intellectual property.
They own all of it, straight up. Like, it doesn't matter. They own it. And again, that's where, like you mentioned before, that's where a lot of these lawsuits are coming from. Is
Hmm.
their states are saying, "Hey, you have made millions, and now you're making billions of dollars off of these things, and the people who created them often died poor."
Most
Like
famously, Bob Kane, guy
Bob
who created
Kane,
Batman.
yeah, all these guys died poor. I mean, yeah, being in comics, you were never promised wealth and fame, right? That was never part of this story. It was always a way for artists to make money. And that's why you see them doing 3 or 4 books a month back in the day, right? They're just churning it out because, and again, when you look at the history, you start to understand this will play a little bit later into the episode. Marvel nearly goes bankrupt several times, right? Comics is always one of those things where it's on the fringe of dying every generation
Yeah.
because, like I said, there's all these companies that have existed that were really big and they go away, right? Because it's entertainment.
When was their last golden age for the comic book industry? Was it us when we were kids in elementary school, like that time?
Well, okay, so again, depending on your perspective, it's right now. So this is what I'm saying, right? A
Yeah.
lot of this is you have to have that larger view of the industry itself, right?
Hmm.
And that's where you can start seeing, okay, things aren't necessarily as cut and dry as we want it to be. In many
Hmm.
ways, you could argue today is the golden age,
Hmm.
but it's very, very different. Now, don't get me wrong, direct sales is falling out. That's your comic book stores. But again, we can talk about that in a little bit. There's still a lot to sort of lay down. But so your golden age, that's your post World War II. Really, that's considered the golden age.
I'm
World
talking
War II
about
is
the
over.
time when most people bought
That's
actual
what I'm saying.
physical comic
Yeah.
books.
No,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's post World War II.
Oh.
It's really up until about the 70s. Um, my pal Superman or Jimmy Olsen, Superman, was it my pal? Anyway, Jimmy Olsen's comic book, right? Um, on a bad month, and I mean this sincerely with what I'm about to say, on a bad month, would sell over 200,000 copies. That was a bad month in the 60s for Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. That's what it was. Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. That's in the 60s. I need you to understand the top selling comic book right now as a month. Now, this is to define a few terms here for this to make sense. Graphic novel, think of them as a bunch of comic books collected into one story, or it could even be a story that's told originally as one big book. But a comic book is a floppy, that's your monthly publication, and then you
Hmm.
have graphic novels, which are the larger books.
Yeah.
And even that's a gross oversimplification, but just helps us to
Okay,
define.
let me put it like this. It would be like, but if you were really into a TV show, like buying an individual DVD of like certain episodes, whereas a
Right.
graphic novel would be like buying the
The
entire
entire
season
season.
box set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good way of saying it. So right now, your number one selling monthly comic book gets less than 200,000. These are non-event comics,
Hmm.
get less than 200,000 a month. That's your number one top selling comic as a monthly comic book. Graphic novels are a different story, but as a monthly, my pal Jimmy Olsen would kick the ass of any comic book being produced today
And that was
as
back in
far
the
as sales are
70s.
concerned. That's back in the 60s and 50s and
Yeah.
60s. Yeah.
Because I
That's
feel like
how bad
when
it
we were kids, I feel like that was the last real time when buying physical comics was pretty common amongst us,
yeah,
and our friends and amongst
as a
kids.
broader
Because a
part
lot
of
of
the
us were
niche.
buying comics.
Yeah.
I feel like we were really the last generation that were actually like buying comics. I mean, there's still people buying comics, right? But we were
Well,
where
yeah.
it was like common amongst most kids to buy comic books, right?
So let me again, this is where it's going to be really important to define the terms. You are correct if we mean comic book to mean monthly
Monthly,
floppies.
yeah, individual issues.
Right, because like
Yeah.
I said, this is as golden an age as comics has ever enjoyed.
Hmm.
But we're going to, so let's go ahead and skip. So let me define one thing, then we'll skip to where we are today.
Hmm.
The monthlies, yeah. The last big push was the 90s, but that was the investor boom. Like you would sell million, the number one selling comic of all time is still, and will probably never be changed, is Jim Lee's X-Men 1 when they relaunched with Jim Lee. That is the number one selling comic of all time. And the reason is it had 4 or 5 different covers, right? It
And you
was a
had to
big
buy
deal,
all of them.
and you bought all of them. So yeah, there was the gimmick, but you had the investors, and it's in the 90s. You see all these things: Wolverine getting his adamantium ripped out of his body, and it had a special you saw holofoil covers, you
Hmm.
saw the marriage of Superman, you saw the death of Superman, all in the 90s. There was these big gimmick things, Executioner song, all of that, and they did it because it was like, hey, and you see all these number one issues coming out, right?
Oh yeah.
Everything was, and here's Zero Hour for DC, which is an unsung hero as far as I'm concerned. But you got Spider-Man 2099, which I still love. But you got the 2099 run. There's a lot of these pushes with these holofoil covers, and it's an investor, and these investors were buying 10 or 20 copies of these books because people were on television and radio saying, invest in comic books, because a few comics had sold for
Do you
quite a
remember that
substantial amount of money.
holofoil Spider-Man #1, Todd McFarlane?
Oh
All the
yeah.
kids got with the
Oh
silver
yeah.
webs.
Yep. Oh yeah. I loved it. I
Dude,
had it.
that thing was flying off the shelves.
It was. And so these investors were telling people, like, if you go and you buy these comic books for a couple bucks a piece, you can turn around in 20 years or 5 years or what, 5, 10, 20 years and sell them for hundreds or thousands of or tens of thousands of dollars at a time, right? And you can fund your kids college fund with that. Well, the problem is because most professionals don't, particularly when it comes to finances, professionals don't know a damn thing. What they failed to realize is all of the comic books that were going for high money had two things in common. One, they came from a time before people were preserving back issues, which really don't start until the 70s. Two, these were important books for one reason or another. Amazing Fantasy 14, first introduction of Superman, or of Spider-Man rather. Fantastic Four 1, Amazing Fantasy with Thor, right? These were important books, but they were rare. And anything pre-World War II is exceptionally rare because you had the big recycling drives. What was the
Yeah.
first thing to get thrown out? Comic books. That's why there's only a handful of Action Comics 1, the first Superman, Detective Comics 1, the first Batman, right? You only have a handful of these things. Heck, a Donald Duck comic from that period will go for tens of thousands of dollars because they are literally relics of this age. They're artifacts. Well, post the 1960s, once you get into the 70s, basically everything drops off as far as cost because they're still around. You still have plenty of comics. Well, then you flash forward to the 90s, you've got a million copies of X-Men 1 running, out in the
Hmm.
field, and no one's throwing them away. No one's recycling them. They're all being kept in their bag, right? You turn around and you say, these investors said, okay, well, I've got Spawn issue 1. Who wants to buy it? Everyone else turns around and says, I got 20 of them. What are you talking about? It's like anything else. By the way, free advice. When people talk about, oh, it's a collectible coin made out of silver or gold or whatever, spend your money on silver, actual silver, or gold, you know,
Hmm.
bullion. Do not buy quarters that were made like the pre 1965 silver half dollars, where it's like, oh, it's
Hmm.
90% silver. It is legal tender. It is only worth 25 cents or 50 cents or whatever it is demarked on it. I think it's a quarter. It's only worth 25 cents. It is still a legal tender thing. And everyone's like, oh, it's a collectible. You're right. It's being held as collectible. You're getting scammed. The reason, if you want to invest in precious metals, invest in the metal. That's the whole point, right? Silver is an industrial metal. Its value will never go away. That's why you hold on to it, because the value is the
Hmm.
silver. It's 1 troy ounce. You can point and say, this is worth this much, right?
Hmm.
But the thing about collectibles is it's only the collectability is only valuable if it is rare and important. And then the third component here, and the most important component, is someone has to be willing to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key. So you come up, into the 90s, you have the speculator boom. The industry's never been bigger from a monetary standpoint, but now everyone's turning around and being like, oh, I don't need to buy these comics. They're not going to be worth hundreds or thousands of dollars in the future. And so now you have this huge crash in the late 90s because everyone
Yeah.
gets wise. There, Lone Star Comics it's a large comic chain here in North Texas. To this day, I'm not kidding. Well, they may have sold it, they may have gotten rid of them or thrown them away by now, but as of 10, 15 years ago, they still had a pallet or two of the Death of Superman comics on hand. That's how much they had over ordered. So that happens right in
Yeah.
at the end of the speculator bust. So that nearly wipes out most comic companies. Is this speculator collapse? Things were bad. Marvel goes into bankruptcy during this time. DC didn't because Warner Brothers owned them. Warner Brothers bought out DC a long time ago, and so you have this history, and then 2000s things start coming back, and then movies made, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really up to this point, outside of Superman, most of your movies, like there was a Punisher movie with Dolph
Well,
Lundgren,
Batman too, but
well, yeah,
Superman and
in
Batman.
Batman,
Yeah.
but that's what I'm saying. You got that, you got your Batmans, you got the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Which is an indie thing. You get the Shadow, you get the
There
Phantom.
weren't too many big Marvel movies back then.
No,
Not
there weren't.
until yeah.
Not until 2000s, and then you get Spider-Man, then you get the X-Men, and of course, everyone seems to forget when Marvel finally got the rights to the movies. And of course, you had you had Hulk early on, that's a whole other kettle of fish. When they finally get the rights back, because they had, again, to save themselves, they had sold movie rights. Like there were Marvel movies and television shows in the 70s of Spider-Man,
Yeah.
Captain America, the Hulk. Everyone remembers that. Daredevil had like you had these things being because they were just trying to make money. The cartoons, whole not same thing.
In video games, there was a lot of them in video
Yeah,
games.
video games, right? They were
Yeah.
cartoons. That's how they were doing this. But so finally Marvel gets the rights back to Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor, and they're like, okay, we have enough that we can do our own Marvel universe. We can actually we can control these characters. And the Hulk, they were finally able to, Paramount or Universal, one of the two, owns the Hulk. But they essentially have sort of like a contract with, like, they're never going to give that up for some reason. Anyway, I remember when they first announced Iron Man, they said, here comes Marvel sends in the B Squad
I
on
remember
Entertainment Weekly, right? I'm like, what are you talking about, the B Squad? It's friggin' Iron Man, Captain America. But that's the thing, is for the broader culture, they didn't understand who these characters really were, or what, or the stories that could be told with them. So this relaunches them now. And so now there's enough money in the industry between Disney and whoever's going to end up buying DC. But with Disney and Marvel got bought out by Disney. Right now, they exist. Marvel and DC exist as nothing more than IP generation,
Yeah.
intellectual property for Disney and whoever's going to end up buying Warner Brothers to produce movies and television shows and merchandise. And that's it. That's all they exist for. And this is going to come to the point
They're a
of money.
licensing factory,
Right.
basically. Yeah.
And as test beds for characters and stories and all that. And this is kind of getting to the meat of what Donny wanted to talk about, right? Which is that the comics made before the mid 2000s, right? Trust me, there was a lot of crap that was put out. Like, anyone says, "Oh, it's really bad now," and it is. But like, if they look back and say it was always this panacea of creativity and genius, I'm going to look at you and be like, you're not paying attention, because there was always a ton of crap out there, right? But here's the big difference. And when you read the writings of these authors, like your Jack Kirby's, your Will Eisner's, your Stan Lee's, Ditko's that's a whole other kettle of fish. Him, but he still
Mhm.
had the same sentiment, right? You were worth only what you could sell. So they were, your Chris Claremonts, your John Burns, they cared about what the audience wanted because they couldn't make money if they couldn't sell those comics, right? There was that pressure to look at the audience and say, who's buying the comic books? How do we sell it to them? How do we keep them?
Well,
That was always the emphasis.
you can tell a lot of these writers and artists earlier on were a lot more invested in the characters than a lot of these writers are now, right? Because you had someone like what was his name?
Yes,
Like I was big into the Hulk, right? So the
right,
guy
yeah.
who was doing the Hulk at the time was what was his name? Dale Keown.
It
Is that
depends
how
on
you
when you're
pronounce his
talking,
name?
but that sounds about right. Yeah, for that
Right? And
period.
that guy was specifically like just Hulk, right? Like he
Yeah,
did just nothing but Hulk the whole time.
I
He
think he
was
did a
like
few other
the Hulk
stories.
stories, right?
Yeah, yeah,
He wrote them all for a while.
yeah.
So he was the Hulk guy, and the Hulk was drawn always in his art style. And you had this one guy that was completely invested in this one character. So you got to see how you saw how that panned out, right? That's when you
Mhm.
first saw the introduction of the Professor Hulk,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
I don't know. Like, okay, let's get into it then. Comic books nowadays, right?
Yeah.
We most of the people listening at home are exposed to these Marvel DC characters primarily because of TV shows nowadays
Yeah.
and movies
Yeah.
nowadays.
And movies. Yeah.
The print industry is still going on, but yeah, if you could just fill people in on what's going on with the print comic book print industry, the Western comic book
Mhm.
print industry
Right.
these days, and how it's different from how when we were kids.
So again, this goes back to a couple things, right? And I want to I want to go back just one step for just one quick
Okay.
second because I don't necessarily. Yes, they did care about these characters, right? You're not
Hmm.
wrong, right? I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but they cared more about the fact that they were artists and writers,
Hmm.
and they knew that they could only maintain work if they kept the customer happy. It was about customer satisfaction. They said, we want to enjoy what we're doing, but we know we got to get butts in the seats, right? We got to get those kids buying those comics. So that was really more the concern, which is where the care came from, right? It's not that they didn't care about the characters, but they also understood what they were trying to do. And that's gonna be very important following up. Like I said, in the 60s, which really was the golden age, um, you had my pal Jimmy Olsen, one of the least, selling over 200,000 copies a month. That's insane. Now, your big event comics may sell about that or slightly more, but your average monthlies are not, right? And that's sort of the problem. The print industry itself for monthly issues is dying. These comic book stores are dying. And the comic book stores are complaining about this. They are saying, "Hey, this is not what you need to fix this because Marvel, DC, their sales are trash in the monthly floppies, right? Marvel and DC will turn around and say comic books have never been bigger, and they're right. But they're lying to you when they say that because what they do is they take and include sales of manga and Scholastic and put it all in with their graphic novels and they say, "Look, here's how big the industry is. The industry's fine." Well, yeah, the industry's fine when you're talking about when you look at all of this manga, which is Japanese and Korean. I mean, technically manga is Japanese, but everyone's basically taking anything from Asia, right, which includes Korea, is taking.
Most Korean people in Korea, they read Japanese manga.
No, I know, but
Yeah,
Korea is blowing up. I mean,
yeah,
Korea is owning the video game market, but they still produce their own comics as well. But you're right,
yeah,
manga, which is why everyone drops it under manga. Like there
yeah.
isn't. Yeah. But anyway, it's Japanese created comic books and it's done very, very differently. It's a very large and healthy market over there because I think they're doing it correctly. And we can talk about why that is. But they get bundled together as a graphic novel and sold here, and people are eating it up. They are buying it. You go into a Barnes and Noble and you look at where the Western comics are, right? And then
Hmm.
look at the manga section. It is too. I remember when manga was like a small section.
Hmm.
It maybe had its own thing. Now it's the whole friggin' section. And
Yeah.
of and on the American side, on the Western side, you have a lot of room taken up by big art books, right? Where it's like the art of this, the art of that. It Whereas with manga, it's all of them. All of them are the novels or the graphic novels where they've
Yeah.
collected these weekly stories and put them together as one story. And Scholastic has a lot of these comic books. Bone, again, creator owned thing forever. Bone is still a huge seller. Um, and you've got all these other comics that are there in for young readers that are getting collected stories, and they are in Scholastic is just killing it with that stuff. And again, graphic novels sell very, very well because people are their tastes have changed, right?
Hmm.
And this is where it's important. This is getting to the crux. Why is the reason the monthly books are dying? And I would argue we've never had a time where there was better art. There's never been better art, better, and some of these stories are legitimately amazing,
I
right?
have been noticing the art's been getting better and better.
Yeah, and it's because in the reproductions, the whole nine yards. But here's the thing: the reason, again, as technology grows and changes, how we consume media is changing. So that's definitely a big part of it. You're not getting new readers. The young kids don't want to read the American comics. And the reason for it is they're no longer targeted to teens and preteens. They're all aimed at 30 and 40 plus year olds.
Hmm.
And even then, a lot of the 30 and 40 year olds, they're not happy with the comics because when you talk about Marvel and DC specifically, right?
Hmm.
Not the independents, because because again, I still think this is a golden age because of the independents, right? But Marvel and DC, a lot of their stuff is they're doing it. The authors are writing and the art is going for these stories to look good on Twitter.
All right, let's just come out and just say it. They've gone woke.
Mhm.
And American
Yeah.
comic books is not the place to be going woke because that's not what the audience is expecting.
Let's define woke here because this is
Okay.
important because
All right.
people will sit here and say, "Oh, Star Trek's always been woke. Comics have always been woke." Stop. A lot of people want woke to mean good, right? Meaning ethically and morally good.
Hmm.
It's like racism is bad. Okay, yeah, comics fought against racism. They've
Yeah.
always sort of had that theme. That's what Star Trek, right? However, when you look at those things in the 60s, all those things that they were fighting against racism, they were fighting for equality of merit, right? They were fighting for for ideas of justice. They were
Hmm.
fighting for ideas again of equality. Those ideas were always present because it was to promote what is good for humanity. Woke, this new this whole woke agenda, the LGBTQ thing, all of it. That's not what this is. This is a very specific neo-Marxist view of humanity. It is a very hyper political viewpoint. Now, again, there's always been liberalism in comics, like you can see them in certain character
Yeah.
designs, but it was commies bad, right? It was America good. It was women are good, men are good, right? There were still certain things they're still trying to appeal to this. Now we've got drag queen superheroes and we have transgender superheroes. Like they're
Or
trying
we
to
have
push
like someone like Miss Marvel who's really just there to check all the boxes, right?
right.
Oh,
Well,
we need to have a young woman of color because
mhm.
that's what we need because those are the boxes that we must check in order to have this new character.
Yeah.
Even though that appeals again because comic book readers are primarily male and primarily Caucasian,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, or Asian. Well, and so here's the thing, it's not like there haven't been black and female and
Yeah,
Asian and Hispanic comic book superheroes. They've always been there.
they've been there.
They've always been there, and they've been done well. And yeah, sometimes they are legacy hero where, okay, this character didn't quite work out, so we'll use this one. The problem was you didn't have, there was two things. For a character to work, they have to be interesting and they have to be an actual character, right?
Yeah.
Meaning they have a personality, they have foibles, they have virtues, they have failings, and you can tell an interesting story. The problem with all of these new characters is that isn't why they're being designed.
Right.
They're being designed simply as the black character or the gay character or the
So
female character.
for people listening at home, Ms. Marvel is the newest, is like one of the newer Marvel characters that got introduced into the continuity in the Disney Plus shows and then in the Captain Marvel movies.
Yeah.
But she was
Among
also
Milani,
introduced
who
in the
does a
comic.
great job of
Yeah,
portraying her, by the way. Yeah.
yeah, she's a great actress, right? Like lots of charisma. People like her. You could, no issues with her whatsoever, right?
Mhm.
But when Ms. Marvel was introduced as a character, Kamala Khan, she is a girl of, I guess, what was she, Pakistani
Yeah,
descent?
she's a Pakistani Muslim. Yeah.
She's a Pakistani Muslim, and they can't even figure out what her powers are. I guess she was able to stretch like Captain or
Or
whoever,
Mr. Fantastic. It
Mr.
was it's
Fantastic.
very convoluted, yes.
Okay, but nobody
And they
really
made her
gave a
mutant
shit
now
about
too.
her.
Yeah,
But
they
okay, now
never have.
here's another character that would technically be classified as woke, but everyone loves. That's Storm from X-Men,
Yeah.
right?
Oh
She's a
yeah.
black female, and she's been around for ages.
Mhm.
Everyone loves her.
Black Panther.
Black Panther, everyone loves him,
Yeah,
right?
everyone's like, "Oh, there weren't black people until," and I'm like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, stop."
What about
Storm,
Storm?
Black Captain America. I loved, and they killed him off in the television series. That actually cheesed me off. I'm like, "You killed one of my one of my favorite little, sort of side characters."
Mhm,
Battlestar. He was one of the Captain America subset of heroes,
mhm.
right? But he was black. I loved his character. Remember the first time I saw him. Um, Again, you have had characters of all Sunfire. You've had characters of all kinds of different races all over the place. Milestone. I was buying the early Milestone issues when that came out. Your Statics, your Icon and Rockets, Hardware. That is a guy. That's a character who's never been given a fair shake at all. Steel. I loved Steel. When after the death of Superman, you had 4 different Supermen
Mhm.
show up.
Yeah.
Superboy, which was the clone. You had Cyborg Superman, who was actually a replace, who was a that's a whole different thing. You had the Eradicator Superman. Then you had Steel, who was John Henry Irons. I love that comic. And it sold really well. Static sold really well.
Mhm.
These characters, when they're created, Miles Morales sold. There's a reason why people embrace Miles Morales, but not Kamala Khan. The thing is, you have to create a character. That's my point. These characters that are coming out now, they're not characters. They are stand-ins. They're ideological stand-ins for a neo-Marxist propaganda. That's all they are. They're nothing more. So and that's why they all fall flat. That's why they're all rejected. And in many ways, you could argue a lot of the modern, particularly Marvel stuff, is nothing more than just fan fiction. Because it's like, well, hey, let's have this character sleep with here. Oh, Wolverine and Jean Grey and Cyclops, instead of it being a love triangle, now they're in, and it's essentially flat out said they're in some weird thruple thing and they're gang banging. Like this is where they're going with it. This is where it's been.
Yeah,
Well,
they'll
yeah,
make other characters come out of the closet just 'cause, right?
just
Just 'cause
cause,
they want that street
just
cred.
cause, yeah,
Yeah.
and it's hey, let's create a character with that's got a mental disability. Let's have a version of Spider-Man that's in a wheelchair. Like, what kind of
Well,
effing sense
Echo,
does that make?
that new show Echo, right? That girl's an amputee, she's deaf, and she's Native American. There's so
Yeah,
many, and female, so many boxes being checked,
yeah,
right?
yeah. It's to check a box. It isn't to
Yeah.
create an interesting character. And the shows are going to try and save these characters. The problem is the comics are dying because they're not telling interesting stories. These are not characters that you care about. These are not stories that you necessarily care about.
Mhm.
There is no new energy coming into it. But where the energy is, again, manga. And by the way, it's not like manga is a bastion of Christian nationalist uh viewpoints, right? It's like,
No.
you want to talk about characters who are homosexual? That's been in manga the entire time. Literally the entire time. Japan's never had a problem with homosexuality. Uh they've never had the same problem, they've had what you would, even the transgender things a little different. But the point is, they are not they're telling actual stories with actual characters. It isn't, hey, I need to have the gay character, I need to have this character. They're like, here are the characters, here's the stories I want to tell, I'm going to tell it, right?
Hmm.
They're action driven, they know who their audience is, and they're giving the audience what they want. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Akira is for everyone, right? But there's a reason it still sells really, really well, because it's good, right? My Hero Academia, right? The shonen stuff, basically teenage superheroes would be the best way to think about it. Shonen in general, right? That's sort of that.
Yeah.
There's a reason that's huge, right? Like, I'm a Blade of the Immortal guy, right? I
Mm.
love Blade of the Immortal. Hirokai Samura is a brilliant mangaka creator, but like, they're telling really good stories with really good art, and they know how to tell that story, and they
Mm.
understand who the audience is, and that's what they're doing. They have the same mindset of these older creators, which was, I want to tell a story that makes people go out and buy this book. That is not because they all know, hey, Disney's going to keep Marvel around, so we're just here to generate IP. So
Yeah.
I'm going to write a story that's going to go well on Twitter, so that we have a bunch of people who've never read a comic book, will never read a comic book, will go, oh, it's so cool. Look at this gay trans uh you know character, and they've got, and they're from South America, and they've got their arms amputated. Like, it's gonna be they're just doing it to be a filler. And this one's got autism, right? Like,
And
it
and
isn't
the funny thing is,
born out.
most of the people who would appreciate stuff like that
Mhm.
aren't even buying comic books.
That's what I'm saying. They're
Yeah,
never gonna buy these comics. Like,
they're not. That's yeah. You're
well,
appealing to the wrong crowd.
it's like, that's the thing. Like, one of the big things I really hated with the new okay, it was a reboot DC did of the entire universe
Hmm.
in the 80s. Barbara Gordon, who was the original the original Batgirl, Batwoman's a different thing. She was shot by the Joker and paralyzed. They made her, and they kept her paralyzed. They made her Oracle,
Hmm.
which means she was running everything. There have always been people with disabilities in comics. Professor X, Daredevil, these were people who had disabilities, and it was a part of the character. Oracle, that was a big part of her story. She goes from being Batgirl to being bound to a wheelchair. That's a huge story plot, but she's still a freaking hero. And that was the point. She's still a hero. Yeah, she can't go swinging from rooftop to rooftop, but you know what she can do is be a hero. That wasn't, how do we set out to create a wheelchair bound hero? It was, no, she's doing what she can do, right? There was always room for these characters to exist, but they had to actually tell a story. They had to be character driven. It wasn't to check a box. And the problem, and I've met some people, and it's really sort of clicked to me when they're talking about the movies they like and the movies they don't like. I'm like, you liked this movie, like The Flash, right? They're like, oh, Flash was the best movie that I've seen, best superhero movie of, and I'm like,
The Flash, really?
The Flash? I gave it a 6 because it was kind of fun, but it was an honorary 6. I think it's more of a 4 or 5 at best. But it's like, I gave it because the actors were doing the best, but the story sucked. The story was trash. What do you mean this was one of the best superhero movies of the year? What are you talking about? And I realized, after listening to some of the things that he liked, it was not about the story. It wasn't about anything. It was just, oh, do we have a Flash story? Yes. I like Flash is popular. Click. Ezra Miller, he's a they them. Click. We have Michael Keaton Batman. Click.
Nostalgia bait.
Well, it was even nostalgia bait. That's all it was. And again, I thought he did a great job with it. But the reason he liked the movies he likes versus the movies he didn't like, it was box checking. Well, this movie has a bunch of white males in it. That's not, therefore bad. And that's all it was. It was box. He didn't care about the artistry. He didn't care about the plot. He didn't care about any of that. It was just the boxes are checked. And that's the
Mhm.
way a lot of these NPCs think, right? People who don't know what an NPC is, it's non-playable character.
I love the fact that you called him an NPC because that's exactly what people like that are.
Yeah.
NPCs, non-player characters.
Yeah. For people who don't know, in video games, you have characters that you play, and then there's the computer characters that you interact with, right?
Hmm.
The entire point of an NPC is they are there to serve a purpose. When you talk to them, they have certain scripts, and that's it. That's all they're ever
Hmm.
going to say to you, because obviously there isn't a human controlling them. They're a non-playable character. The reason it's become popular in sort of political parlance is a way of saying what an NPC is: someone who does not actually think for themselves. They have no interest in thinking for themselves. They only do and say what is allowed, what has been prescribed, again, by this neo-Marxist ideology that we see, right?
Hmm.
And you can immediately recognize them because they say all the same things in the same way. And if you interact with them at all, and you say, "Okay, well, let me call your idea into question here," there is no thought behind it. It's like, "No, you're bad." This is why you hear racist, homophobic, Trump supporter, whatever. It doesn't matter what you actually believe or say. Those are the insults you get, because they don't actually know what they mean.
Yeah.
They don't understand what they're saying. They don't even understand what it is they believe. They just know, I am allowed to believe this. This is the script. I shall repeat this. That is who these characters are being in these comics in Marvel and DC are being written to. That's how they're being written as, and that's who they're being written for. The problem is these people aren't buying comics. They never
Right.
have. They never will.
They're not interested.
No. And that's why we see a lot of the real life in the art form is being found in manga and in the independents. And the other part is because, again, we have these things, right? There's new ways of telling stories and getting your information out there. So this is, and I've been trying to tell a friend of mine this who runs a comic book company. I've been saying for years, you got to figure out how to make, like, there isn't really a good way to get the digital comics out in a way that I think really works. Like, we're still trying to figure
For
that
like the
out.
consumer, and also works in
Mhm.
like profitability, right?
Mhm. It's like there are digital comics, yes, but the problem is it is a comic book. It is we are going through the same rebirth that comics went through the first time 100 years ago, right?
Hmm.
Initially, comic books were just collected reprints of popular comic strip characters. That's why they were called the funny pages, right? Or they were called funny books, because that's all they were. They were comic strips, usually humorous comic strips, being republished as a book. That's all they were. Well, again, what's a graphic novel? Monthlies that have been collected together. Even the mangas, that's what they are. The digital comics, what are they? They're just digital versions of these monthly stories that have been put onto the phone. They aren't really designed for it. Now you have things like webtoons, which is evolving right now.
Hmm.
But the problem with webtoons is it still has the same problem that comics used to have, right? Back in the day, as we mentioned at the very beginning, comics used to be a 9-panel, a 6 or 9 panel page, right? Meaning you had your rectangular page and you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or in some cases, um, oh no, 8 panels. Sorry, yeah, 6 or 8 panels. I kept saying 9, but it was just a grid. Oh no, you would have 9s because like the very early you had you had 3 across. That's what it was. It was 3 across, and then you'd have 3 or 4 lines of these boxes. Again, like a daily comic strip, right? Same thing. And that was your format. The webtoons are basically the same thing, where it's 1 panel of the exact same size, and you just scroll down, right? Not a lot of room for variance, not a lot of room to really push the art form. So we're still trying to figure out that part out. So again, this is what I'm saying. But that's also what's cutting into the sales of the monthly comics, because the people who want to go and buy a comic book, a physical comic book, are my age or maybe like 5 and 10 years younger. It isn't that there aren't younger people coming in, but it's not at the same rate they used to. You have
Yeah.
to go to a comic book store, a store that sells comic books. You can't just go to 7-Eleven and buy a magazine anymore. You can't go to, you're not going to find them at, there isn't a spinner rack
I remember
at, your,
those.
at a drugstore. Man, that's my new, and I mean this very sincerely, my new sort of bucket list thing to own when I have both space and money for it. It would have, for me to buy this, I have to be making a ton of money, and I have to probably be in a new house to have a place for it. I want to spin a rack to put my favorite comics on.
They don't take up that much space, do they?
Well, I don't have. You've been in my house, so I don't have a lot of room to give at the moment. Now that being said, when the kids are gone, or if we move, I will. One of my things I will have an official art studio, broadcast studio kind of thing. I will absolutely make room in there for a spinner rack. So, and since I will have comics coming out soon, to fill that spinner rack. But that's the only tease y'all are getting for this episode. Anyway, point being, the way, so the medium is changing right now, and that's sort of the big thing. Marvel and DC suck because they aren't writing for the audience. They're not writing to get a new audience. They're writing so they can get check marks on Twitter from people who are NPCs to begin with, and people who don't even care about the comics medium to begin with. And by the way, that shows up in their sales.
Yeah.
In the industry is that, if people are like, oh, the industry's dying. The industry is always dying. It's always dying. The thing is, when most people say industry, they mean Marvel or DC, right? They mean some big conglomerate. They don't mean the independents who have always been there. Your Will Eisners, who's never part of that system. They don't mean these other, these other people who find a way to get out there and tell that story. They certainly don't mean the manga. Manga's taking over the place because they're telling good stories.
Well, not just that, but then they're also releasing anime based off those same stories. So then you've reached an even wider audience, right? Because I know a lot of people who read Naruto, but then they also watch the anime series.
Yep. And the animes are faithful adaptations of these stories. And this is actually a little complaint I have about it. It's like, hey, like Sword Art Online, those first 2 seasons, right? I would have liked to have seen them made some changes to that story to make it, because I think there were some really missed opportunities that the animators could have seen and said, hey, I see what you're saying. We can talk about this offline. I see what you're doing here, but let's make these changes here, here, and here to make it a better story, and it would have worked. And it's like, but they don't want to, because that's a deviation from what everyone loved, right?
Yeah.
From what everyone bought. I think there's room for that. But the point is, it isn't doing what they're doing with these movies where they're like, okay, here, let's change everything about these characters. And let's race swap everyone for the sake of race swap.
You mean like what American studios love doing?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. Like, I don't care if, the original Batman, well, not the original Batman, but the 1989 Keaton film, right? Who plays Harvey Dent? Friggin' Lando Calrissian.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody cared. People were like, oh, no, that was controversial. No, it wasn't. I was there. Don't tell me it was controversial.
Nobody gave a shit.
Nobody
cared.
Because why? Guess who's playing Harvey Dent? Friggin' Lando Calrissian. Nobody cared that they race swapped Nick Fury for Samuel L. Jackson.
Nobody cared about that
at all. Nobody. And there's 2 reasons why. And there's 2 reasons why that one worked very specifically. 1, Ultimate Universe already had him in there. But 2, it was clearly not, they weren't trying to be diverse. It was because it was friggin' Samuel L. Jackson. People loved Samuel L. Jackson. He was great. He did a great job. It was very clear they weren't trying to appease anyone. They were just trying to tell a good story. The problem, and this is the problem why race swapping has become such a big deal. It actually limits the times when it would be either appropriate to race swap someone or cool because, hey, we got a great actor. Nobody cared that Will Smith played the main character in I Am Legend.
Right.
Like, nobody cared that Denzel Washington right? Was playing one of the main characters in the new Magnificent Seven that came out a few years ago, which
Nobody
was
cared that Idris Elba was Heimdall.
yeah, because these are actors of merit. And
Hmm.
it was clearly it was clear they weren't trying to do it. When you come out and say, well, look, we've race swapped these characters for diversity, you're being pandered to, and that's the problem. And then you're being given crappy stories. You're being
Remember
given,
Iron Fist?
yeah.
Iron Fist almost got, they tried to cancel Iron Fist,
Mhm.
and they accused him of like race swapping to the whitewashing that character
Yeah.
without anyone realizing that that character was originally a white guy.
Yeah. And think about how racist is this? Well, he's a
Yeah.
martial artist. He's got to be Asian.
And then people were complaining, why do you have a white guy playing Iron Fist? Because Iron Fist was white.
Well, and that's
Duh.
okay. So let's talk about Iron Fist for a quick second, because this is a big thing. This is what I mean. First of all, it's racist to say that someone who's a martial artist has to be Asian. But they're like, well, he comes from the city of Kunlun. No, he was a white kid. He was the son of a wealthy financier. Their plane crashes. I won't go into the specifics. The plane crashes. He survives. He's taken in by the monks of Kunlun and taught, and he becomes the Iron Fist. He earns the Iron Fist, right? And then he comes back as a superhero. This is an old trope. And people don't understand what this trope is. There's the trope of someone who comes from a Western nation, goes to somewhere off in the distance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some distant land, learns new things, and then comes back to be the hero. That's the whole hero's journey, right? You leave your home, you go on an adventure, and you come back learning these new things. Post World War II, this was a big story arc because and point that was pushed because they wanted to avoid this idea of, we just spent a bunch of years saying particularly the Japanese are evil, and Imperial Japan was, and we've spent a bunch of years. Then of course we then follow up with a bunch of years in Korea. There was this big push in media to say, look at the far, and again, this has been around for a while. Look at the Orient.
Mm-hmm.
It's this far and exotic place. They have all these foreign and exotic ideas and all these cool things. It isn't that place cool, right? It's so the people who go there and then come back and they have this new wisdom, and it was to glorify Asians and Asian societies to say,
But
look,
then if
they
you
have all
made
this.
but then if you
Yeah,
made the character Asian, it would kind of defeated the purpose. To like his story wouldn't make sense anymore, right?
exactly.
Right.
You change him, and again, it goes. I get back to the sheer racism of, well, he's a martial artist, he's got to be Asian. Like that's the most racist thing I've ever. It's that's what's racist. But that's the whole point, right? We have these characters now. Again, the Eternals is a great example. You just race swapped all the characters except for one, and you did it so that he could be the bad guy. So the one white guy is the bad guy,
Mm-hmm.
and everything else and everyone else like, no, they're the good people because they're race swapped, and that's what they said that's what they were doing. Again, they did it for clicks. They did it for likes on Twitter. They didn't do it because they were trying to tell an organic story. They were trying to tell a good story.
Yeah.
They were doing it for clicks. But again, here's the thing. Guess what? This stuff happens in comics all the time. If Marvel and DC will never go away. They're too big, they're worth too much money. They will always exist in some form. But the comic industry is always going to be around. It's going to change forms a little bit. Maybe we're not going to get the monthlies anymore. It'll be digital, right? And then we'll have graphic novels. That may be how we get everything moving forward. I don't have a problem with that because it's just the evolution of the technology. We're going through the same periods that we've gone through in the past. Again, Marvel has nearly collapsed like 3 or 4 times over the last 70 plus years when it was originally Timely, and like it was originally Timely Comics. DC didn't used to be DC Comics. These were all different stories, right? These were all different companies. They've grown, they've changed. Again, there were whole comic companies that existed for 30, 40 years and then died, right? This is just another period of time, right? It's just another point of evolution. So yeah, is this a golden age? It is and it isn't. For all the same reasons that it has and has not been in the past. Right?
Yeah.
In the 50s and 60s, yeah, the monthlies, that was sort of height of technology. Everyone read magazines, everyone read newspapers, and so comics is always the redheaded stepchild of whatever the medium is, right? Digital, streaming, that's the new thing. So comics is going to evolve in a way that accommodates this thing. We're still in the process of learning how to do that, and that's
Hmm.
okay, right? That's how it's going to be. Maybe in the future, instead of what you'll have is free stuff that you read on Twitter and on Facebook or whatever, Instagram or a website, and then you get to buy a book with extra material, right? That may be how this all evolves and shakes out. You read it one panel at a time, or one page, or maybe 2 or 3 pages a week, right? Again, a lot of comic books used to be you didn't have an entire comic book dedicated to one character and one story. Used to be you got a 7-page story of this character and 7-page story of this character, 10-page
Well,
story of this character.
that's the other problem with like a lot of these modern Western comic books these days, because the world is so
Mhm.
big and there's so many characters, where that in order to keep up with any story arc, you have to kind of keep up with what's going on in all the other story arcs.
Yes,
But the thing is,
that is
there's
the
so
number
many
one complaint.
characters. Like there will always be these little snippets in the comic books. Oh, refer to this character's issue
Mhm.
number 45 to get a fucking clue of what this person just said,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
So like manga and anime, they don't suffer through that because they're all self-contained, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's in fact, there is a channel on YouTube I pop in and out of every once in a while. Where they just talk about comics, and this guy who's getting ready to shut down like his channel, or at least several of the channels that he was doing, he came out and said, guys, look, Marvel, I do this for a living and I can't keep track of what you're doing because you have all these crossover events, and I'm supposed to, if I want to read this crossover event, I have to buy 10 freaking books a month.
Mm-hmm.
How, and you won't even tell me which ones are important for me to get.
Yeah.
Right? You're telling me I have to get all these books. Well, some of these books clearly have nothing to do with the crossover. So why am I reading this book? But you're telling me I have to buy the book to find out that it's not really involved. What is going on? And so everything's about these big events. They're trying to sell more volume. They're not going for quality. And that's how all of this is shaking out, which is why Substack is becoming a big thing for comics as well. They made a push for comic books on Substack for
Hmm.
these big comic artists and writers to go over there and bring their stuff to them so that you could read a different form of comic book, right?
Yeah.
Like I said, comics are um, they are the redheaded stepchild of whatever the media is at the time. Always has been, always will be. It's always supposed to be almost on the verge of death because it's a fringe thing. It's punk. There's a reason why comic books have always been rock and roll. They've always been punk rock, right? There was always a comic book thing going on with those movements because that's what we are. This period that we're going through, yeah, big multinational corporations have taken these IPs and they're trashing them. Okay. But
Yeah. So they're trying to feminize everything, right? Even
yeah,
though women don't read that shit. So it's like, who are you really appealing to?
and
You know,
women
I
used
started
to.
thinking about it, right?
Mhm.
Imagine if they were to somehow try to come out with a Barbie movie or a Barbie comic book, but try to make it appeal to men. How would they go about
Yeah.
doing that? You would
Yeah.
turn Barbie into an assassin or something.
Oh, exactly. No,
Yeah.
precisely. Well, here's the thing. Women did used to read comic books back in the day. There were this is nuts for most people to understand, but right after World War II, romance comics were a big thing. Romances and westerns were huge in the
Oh,
50s.
actually, and I can tell you this because I was there firsthand. You know, when you go to Korea, a
Mhm.
lot of the people who read a lot of these mangas, it's mostly girls and women, and a
Mhm.
lot of them are like romance like
Yeah.
stories.
A lot of them are
Wow.
romance stories. That's the thing. There is a market for this, but that's the thing, right? They're not trying to subvert the overall view of the universe
No.
of what's male and this goes back to the idea that a lot of this stuff, the problem is that it's just nothing more than neo-Marxist propaganda. And that's why all these things suck, is because that's what it is. It's not trying to tell a good story. It's trying to reshape reality. And it's trying to say, no, 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 reality can be whatever we want it to be. I'm going to tell you what it should be. And it's propaganda.
Yeah.
That's all it is. Whereas the manga is just trying to tell a good story.
Actually, come to think of it, now that I think back on it, most of the manga I seen that were Korean titles, specifically
Hmm.
like made in Korea by Korean writers and artists,
Hmm.
most of them I would say were for girls.
Actually, it doesn't surprise me
Yeah.
at all. So here's the thing. So people are saying, okay, well, why is manga so big, right? Okay. By the way, the Franco-Austrian comic scene is huge, and they love Conan. They love their sword and sorcery. And they love themselves some Western comics. You, some of the best Western comics you're ever going to read are coming out of France.
I'm guessing most of
Comics
those
are
people are
huge.
dudes.
Yeah, and they're writing really
Yeah.
good stories. But let's talk about manga for a second. Yeah, you still have romance novels or
Mhm.
romance comics that come. Again, we used to publish romance comics too, but they still do. But you know what other kind of stories you can get from a manga? You don't just get superheroes and romance novels. You get stories about about chefs. You
Yeah.
get stories about volleyball players,
Chess.
baseball players, chess players, tennis players.
Mhm.
You name it. There is a manga out there
Oh, dude,
for that.
there's so many mangas about chefs.
Yeah,
So many like food ones, like
yeah,
restaurant ones. Like,
food stuff, and
yeah,
it's like
so many.
there's a whole genre of this stuff, and
Yeah.
there's actually one manga that they've actually said it is untranslatable because essentially the entire premise revolves around like code breaking and puzzle solving. That's the entire premise of this manga, but because all of it required like it only works in Japanese because these codes and these illusions all they're like we can't everyone's tried they're like we cannot translate this thing. But think about it. It's an entire comic book based on code breaking and puzzle solving. That's what it is. Man, manga has something for everybody. And that's the point. That's why it works as an industry as a whole. The other thing that they're doing is that they are there to tell good stories. They understand the audience they're trying to market to, and they're telling those stories in ways that they care about.
Yeah.
They're not trying to appease some NPC on Twitter. That's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to meet and build their audience. And that's how it should be. And again, that's how it's supposed to be. That's how
That's how it's
the
supposed to be. Yeah.
that's how the free market is. This is the thing. The difference between free markets and command and control economies is the free market, your customer gets to tell you what they want. And if you don't listen to your customer, you're gonna go away. You're
Yeah.
gonna die. And we're seeing it happen with Disney. We're seeing it happen with all these companies
We're seeing it happen
because
with Marvel
everyone's
when they try to feminize something that's inherently geared towards young men. Right.
well,
It's like trying to sell a salad at McDonald's.
which is still yeah. The fact that you can
Yeah.
still do that is insane. By the way, I don't ever go to McDonald's really, because I mean if I do, I get like the chicken sandwich or the McChicken because it's like it used to be $1.
I go for the
Um,
breakfasts mostly.
I get that. Yeah,
Yeah.
but
I
I
like
went
their
there last
halftime.
night to write because I just sometimes you just got to get away from everything for a minute.
Mhm.
Pop in the. Normally, I go to this other place, but I just didn't feel like getting sexually harassed by the waitress. That's not a joke. And so I went to the McDonald's that's right next to it. I ordered a large fry, and large fries, right? They're
Mhm.
like this, right? No,
Yeah.
this thing was like half. I'm like, wait, this is a large now? Again, the economy's dying, but we're seeing these industries take huge hits because people don't want what they're selling anymore because you could like phase one and phase two was about the love of these characters and the love of what they stood for, and then phase three on it's about people realized, oh, we can grab money, we can spread, and we need to get these DEI initiatives out there for the investment bankers. Again, the
Yeah.
act, the they episode I did last year,
Yeah.
right? That's all this is. That's all that's happening here. But again, Marvel and DC is never going to go away. However, the industry as a whole is going to grow. It's going to change. It's going to evolve, and that's fine. That's the way it should
Mm.
be.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've gone on long enough, Jason
Mhm.
McLean. Oh, last question.
Yeah.
I was flipping through Netflix and I saw that they actually had a Blade of the Immortals movie. Is it worth
Yes.
checking out? Should I watch it?
Yes. I mean, it's worth watching. But again, like any anime that's adapted in or manga rather that's adapted into a live action film, I think there's things that don't translate as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem. Like I
Mangas are really designed to be adapted
right.
into a series, right?
Yeah, like there's like okay, so this goes back to my original point of like I don't mind there being some changes in stories and how characters are portrayed because sometimes you got to do that because what works on paper isn't going to work in real life,
Hmm.
right? And anytime they try to do it directly, it's like, yeah, that doesn't work. It's clear it doesn't work. But again, the problem it's still I'd still give it a watch because I love it. I've seen it. It's good, but it's not as good as the comic. It can't be. Because it's a
Yeah.
different medium. It's in time.
Yeah.
It's designed to be that, and the problem is, um, sometimes you just gotta let a medium be what it is.
And with that, folks, I hope you enjoyed our talk about comic books. We'll touch back up on this topic some more, and we'll bring some other people on, and we'll talk about comic books because we all love them. And yeah, I guess we'll leave it at that. Bye. Yo, I just realized I barely cussed this episode.
Yeah,
Sometimes I forget to cuss. I got to
you're
stay
still.
on brand.
You do realize you're still going, right?
Yeah. All right. End record right the fuck now. Bye.